There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between radio and bar talk, between commentary and recaps, and it lies between the pit of man's Netflix subscriptions and the summit of his binge-watching ability. This is the dimension of podcasting and the Twilight Zone. These are the Zone-i-Sodes. And now your hosts, Brandon Davis and Scott McFarland.
And hello to all of you out there in podcast world or land or whatever we say. I have no idea. I'm so confused by this time.
I think it's come down to you say world, I say land, and at least they'll know who's talking.
That's true. And this is the Front Row Movie Reviews podcast, and this is our special venture that Scott and I are about to go on. We've recorded one episode already, but we are now about to tackle episode 1. So 1 will soon be down, 155 to go.
I want to point out how confusing that just was. We recorded episode 1, and now it's time to talk about episode 1. Just throwing it out there. There was an intro episode.
Yes, there was an intro episode. So for those of you who are coming in late.
Yeah, in 2020, when you're joining us in season 3 or 4, you can go back to the beginning and check out the intro episode. We were much, as you can see, we were much better looking 3 or 4 years ago.
Yes, we were. Hopefully not. And so this is episode 2 of our Twilight Zone-i-Sodes, but we're covering episode 1. Hopefully you don't get too confused. But we're covering each episode of the Twilight Zone here, one by one, and just giving our critical eye toward them, and giving little fun either background information or any other kind of fun trivia that go along with each episode, if there was any written about it. But as I guess I haven't mentioned yet, but I am Brandon Davis, and I am the classics guy.
Who the heck are you? Who is this guy? And I am Scott McFarland. I'm the flashbacks guy. So Brandon likes the quality stuff, and I like the schlock. Basically.
They do intertwine every once in a while.
Quality schlock. That's called Rocky. We're recording that soon.
That is. Yeah. For those of you who are listening in 2020, it's not soon.
Check out the classics we did. It was awesome, I'm sure.
Classics. We're going to be covering both Rocky and The Searchers. So Stallone and John Wayne in 1 month is not bad, folks.
They both kind of talk like this. That's more Elvis, but whatever.
That's all right. And so I guess the best place is to start at the beginning here of Twilight Zone. And we're starting here with the pilot called Where Is Everybody?, which aired on October 2nd, 1959 on CBS. And really, for the time period, this was it doesn't seem like it now, but it was a very daring pilot to put on the air. I mean, here you have just really one person appearing in the whole episode, except for the last 2 minutes, I would say. And it's basically just a monologue the whole time of this man played by Earl Holliman. And as I mentioned before in our previous episode, Scott, you're here to provide a plot synopsis of each episode. So do you want to go ahead and show our listeners?
Would you like to put me on the spot? Yes, great. Thank you. So this is actually the second pilot. The first pilot did not air. It actually was used for a different show later on, but I'm sure we may talk about that a different day. So here we are, the first episode of the Twilight Zone. We meet, as Brandon mentioned, a man who is alone in the world, trying to figure out why no one is in the town of Oakwood where he is at. We will find out later this gentleman's name is Mike Ferris. And Mike is an Air Force officer as he learns too, as his what seems to be amnesia starts to go away as he moves throughout the town. He begins like anyone would in this kind of experience, trying to explore his world and figuring out what's going on. But as we continue into this, we see Mike go deeper and deeper into madness, to a point where he starts screaming at the world and trying to figure out what is going on. And that is when we find that Mike is actually in in a test tube, a test device, I guess, that is testing his ability to handle being left alone. And we find out that he is left alone for 484 hours and 35 minutes. So over 20 days he is left alone in this device. And we also find out that Mike is training to be one of the first people to go to the moon, which we'll get into, I'm sure, about the fact this is 1959 when this came out.
Yes.
And we end our episode with Mike being told that he's done well, and the fact that no one would have been able to go as long as he did. And our last shot is Mike looking at the moon, saying, "Hey, don't go away up there. Next time it won't be a dream or a nightmare. Next time it'll be for real. So don't go away. We'll be up there in a little while."
Yeah, and really, really very much of its time, and yet timeless. For 1959. But from the very beginning, Rod Serling, wrote his amazing intros for this show, and this one is actually one of the shortest intros of any of the episodes. He says, "The place is here, the time is now, and the journey into the shadows that we are about to watch could be our journey." And really, it just says it absolutely wonderfully. But the interesting thing about this pilot, and one thing that you'll notice here in the first season, we mentioned it previously in the other episode, but this show is famous for Rod Serling's on-air intros and his hosting, his whole hosting persona. But that really doesn't come into play for a while, and you're going to hear his voice, but you're not going to see him for a while. And also, this episode doesn't have the Twilight Zone classic theme that everyone's familiar with. I do really like the theme song from this first season.
Yeah,
but
and the intro is interesting too. It's very low budget, even for the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, but really, it's of a quality that you didn't see a whole lot at this point in 1959 in terms of scripted television. So it's really interesting, and you got to give CBS credit, because for the whole 5 seasons that the Twilight Zone was on, it was never a rating success. I don't think it ever cracked the top 20, even top 25 maybe. Was always a critical darling, and yet they saw that there was quality here, and they allowed Serling for 5 years to write a little mini movie week after week. And this is a really, really interesting start. Scott, what are your thoughts about the pilot episode?
Well, I think we start out really strong. Not to bury the lead, but I rank this one fairly high. And I think part of it is the acting. You have these kind of movies and stories where the one actor has to kind of handle this himself. In this case, we have Earl Holliman, and he is tasked with taking on the entire narrative of the very first episode of a show. So not only is he having to deal with the fact that he has no one to act off of, but also the fact that he has to bring people into this world for the first time. And I think he does a really good job about that. I also like the theme, and we're probably going to find that there's about 5 or 6 themes that get retread on a lot in this series. And this theme of isolation and not knowing your environment and trying to figure out what's going on is a theme that we're going to hit on quite a bit, but I think it's done very well here. And another thing I like about it is, as I mentioned with the quote at the end, it's actually hopeful at the end, which doesn't happen all the time with the Twilight Zone.
Not a lot.
No, and I'm a space guy. I'm a big fan of the space race and moonshot, and the fact that 10 years before we're going to set foot on the moon, Rod Serling is saying we're going to be there soon. Is something that I think that would have been poignant for somebody watching this in 1959. And being somebody who has wished that we would, stop just being in orbit around our planet and actually start going out to other bodies in the solar system sooner rather than later, I hope we can say that again, that we'll be there soon with the moon and Mars and past that.
Yeah, and for me, this whole episode hinges on Earl Holliman and his performance. And like I said, Rod Serling was a master of casting, and he didn't necessarily cast big names all the time, but he cast people that he knew could bring out the best in his scripts. And I think Earl Holliman was a perfect choice for this part because he's very relatable. There's nothing actory about him when he performs this. If you had cast the wrong actor in this role, it would have just been just misery to sit through. Just this person that you're watching just on their own for 25 minutes, and he really seems like this sort of all-American guy who's been plunged into this sort of world that's not quite we recognize it and yet something's off about it, and it's really, really interesting. And of course, this being the time of the Cold War, I mean, 1959, you're right in the thick of it. And everybody was a little paranoid at this time. And paranoia kind of runs rampant in this episode. Once he starts to realize that something's not quite right here. And his performance just really seals the deal for this episode, and what raises it to a level that it might not have been had a different actor been cast.
Yeah, agreed. And I think we're going to see that a lot. I think, as you mentioned in our intro episode, Rod Serling knew how to cast people, and he got the best people for the job. And that's another thing I think that this anthology series has going for it, is because when you're doing an anthology, you don't have to sign an actor to a long contract. You could grab somebody when they're in between films or in between other TV shows and say, hey, just come down to the set for 2 or 3 days. We'll give you some money and we'll put you in a show. And I think that's why we get some really good acting in this television show throughout its run. And this is one of those.
Yeah. I also really think we need to give credit to Robert Stevens, who directed this. He really paces this episode well, and he shoots it well. And, from the very first scene where he's in the diner, and you see it's abandoned and everything, and just the way that Steven shoots that, and you notice, yes, this is a familiar world, but there's something off about it, and the angles he gets and everything, he really sets the tone for what this show is going to be for the next 5 years. It's not quite. It's interesting because it's not quite what the show is going to be once it reaches its fullest potential, but. For the first step that it's taken, I think that you can't get much better in terms of a pilot episode. Any particular moments from this episode that stand out to you?
Well, one of the things that stands out to me is not really a moment, but just the character himself. Another thing I like about the Twilight Zone, it never assumes that the audience is stupid.
Yeah.
And it never assumes that the characters, unless they're written to be stupid, it never assumes the characters are stupid. So an example of that is when he is in the milkshake diner, or whatever you call it, and he sees that next to him on the bar is a listing of the local basketball team's home and away schedule for the season. And he just thinks to himself, if this is an illusion, I'm putting a lot of effort into making this illusion real. And it's that kind of just cognitive ability for him to, even though he's really going into madness and we're going to see him go deeper and deeper into himself, he's able to say, if this is not real, I'm at least doing a lot of effort to make it look real. And that's just, that's something that a lot of characters in literature and film and TV aren't going to make that decision because, for one, the writer isn't going to think that they should. But also, I think the writer is concerned that the audience isn't going to follow along. But Rod Serling never did that. Rod Serling said, you're going to come along with me or you're not. And that's probably why he never cracked past, the top 20 or whatever it was for shows, because he didn't try to get the mass audience along with him. He just wanted to bring those who could come along for the ride. And I think it's a good start. And I think I like that about this being a character piece.
Well, and I mean, how often, especially in TV today, do you have a character that quotes Dickens?
Yes. Yeah.
It just, I mean, just the best TV shows never talk down to their audience unless you're doing it for a specific reason. But like you said, Serling never assumes that his audience is stupid. He's always playing to the highest denominator, and I think that's why this show holds up, because usually when you're playing to the lowest common denominator, you're sort of playing to the masses and what's popular at that time. And I think that's why the Twilight Zone stays so timeless, is because he never falls into conventions of any particular time or place. It's always just from his mind, and universal themes. And what I love about this episode is the tension, how it builds and builds. In the beginning, Mike is very relaxed, and he's just kind of like a little kid exploring around. And but the more and more he realizes that he is alone and he's not seeing anybody, the more the stakes are raised in this episode. And there's just little moments like when he walks over to the I think it's the garage, and he thinks he sees the woman in the car, and it turns out it's a mannequin or whatever, and that's a little creepy moment. But it really sort of again sets the tone for uneasiness in the world of the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, and we do get told that Mike does walk away from the mannequin, but you wonder if Mike was going to be there long enough, he would have come back to the mannequin. I mean, you can only play tic-tac-toe with yourself for so long.
Well, yeah, I hope.
I have now rendered Brandon speechless.
Yeah, I can't think about that. But also, what's interesting is during these scenes when he's walking around, the majority of the series of Twilight Zone was shot on the MGM backlots, but this pilot was shot at Universal. And if you recognize where Mike Ferris is walking around at, it's the same town square from Back to the Future. And you can see the clock tower and everything, and that's really cool.
I don't do impressions at all, but that was my best duck I could do.
Yeah, that would be interesting to put this episode within that space-time continuum. I don't know how exactly you would do it.
Well, it is 4 years after Marty left, so at this point. Biff is still probably cleaning shit out of his car. That's all.
Yeah. But then I'm thinking about but the climactic scene when he runs into the movie theater, I think is kind of what affects you the most. When he's running in, and he goes up to the projection booth and sees that there's nobody up there, and then he runs out on the street and he's he sees the eye looking at him, and that was the kind of feeling that everyone had during the time of the Cold War, that Big Brother was always watching them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course we have that feeling now too, but just really isolationism, yet always wondering if someone was watching you. It's an interesting paradox, but it plays well in this episode, and Serling really captures that time.
Yeah, and this is where we go back to the director too. For the most part in this episode, it has been filmed not so much claustrophobic. It's been filmed kind of open and just exploring the world. But as soon as he gets into the theater, and then when he comes out, it all goes bonkers. And I think Robert Stevens does a great job of starting to tilt the camera a little bit, especially when you start seeing the traffic signals, and it's just kind of a montage of lights and sounds. Like he's been able to encapsulate this and understand what's going on, and now his mind's just said, I've snapped, I'm done, I can't figure this out. And that's when he starts hitting the crosswalk button, which is a great transition, because we start realizing the crosswalk button is the emergency get me the heck out of here button.
Yeah, and really I can't remember the first time I saw this. I'm trying to think. I think it wasn't actually too long ago. It was probably a few years ago. I'd seen a lot of the really famous Twilight Zone episodes, but this is one that's really not rerun as much as some of the others. And it was interesting because I thought to myself, okay, there's got to be a turn coming, but I wasn't sure exactly what it was going to be. And then when you see what it is, Really a brilliant a brilliant plot device created by Serling, to capture the feelings of that time, and then to also tie it into the race for space.
Yeah.
Um, just absolutely incredible, and I really enjoyed seeing James Gregory as the general, who most famously um, plays Senator Iselin in the original Manchurian Candidate, which is a movie I definitely want to do on classics at some point, which also captures the feeling of the Cold War wonderfully. Um, really interesting. Did you see that turn coming when you first saw this episode?
This is one of those. My memory's pretty terrible, so I don't know when I saw this
Yeah.
one the first time, but it's always been in my head. But you're right, this isn't one that's played a lot, so I probably haven't seen this episode in its entirety for the better part of a decade or more. But I can't. Unfortunately, I cannot take myself back to when I didn't see this and when I didn't know what was going on. But uh, I'm sure that when I was watching it for the first time, you don't see it coming because
Yeah.
they really don't give you a reason. There's a couple times when you rewatch it, like when he starts remembering things, like he starts thinking, I'm in the
Yeah.
Air Force, but then he even asks, what's the Air Force? So he really doesn't
Yeah.
have a full sense of what he is or what he's doing. But the turn is very, very smart. And again, the transition into it is jarring, which is good. I mean, you go through this his mind snapping, and then all of a sudden you got a general and some press looking in on it. So it's a good way to make that leap.
Yeah, and just a really amazing um, commentary. Once again, we talked about Serling really wanted the show to say something, and this was a time when America and the world really were afraid that technology was going to, as great as it was, and all the technical innovations that were being made, there was a fear that technology was going to take over and that we would somehow lose our human interactions with each other. And today, with all the different technological advances, I think this episode speaks just as much. I mean, you're always afraid that somehow the personal interactions that you have every day with people will somehow be taken over by technology. And so for Serling to encapsulate that within the pilot episode really to me, I think is very impressive that he chose to say that within the first episode of the series.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And again, and I've already hit on it, but I also like the fact that even though we are dealing with a man breaking and his mind being lost, at the very end of it, he's okay with it, and he's
Yeah.
looking forward to the next time. And I think it's another thing that Rod Serling does so well, and that is he shows the good in the human race,
Yeah.
even when we really can't always see the good in the human race. And the fact that no matter what we go through and no matter what the experience does to us, we always have to see what's on the next horizon. We always have to
Yeah.
explore what's next. And that's the thing that I always remember about this episode. It's not him in the in Oakwood on by himself. It's not the theater. It's him looking up the moon and saying, "I'm coming for you." And that's just, it's something we don't get often in sci-fi, in television, and in American literature. We don't get that sense of hope as much as we should. And I like that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess now would be a great time, now that we've covered the majority of the episode, to talk about where we rank it. Do you want to explain how we're going to rank each episode?
Absolutely. So what we're doing here is, because we believe that even some of the lesser Twilight Zone episodes are better than a lot of TV out there, we're not going to rank the Twilight Zone amongst other television shows. We're going to rank it amongst itself. So we're going to use a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being a poor episode, 10 being one of the best. And so anything in the middle, a 4, 5, or 6, is an average episode for the Twilight Zone, which again, an average episode in the best TV series of all time is a pretty darn good episode. So we'll be ranking them that way. So Brandon, how about you want to give your rank first?
Sure. In terms of pilots, pilots are always very iffy when you look at different shows. it's very hard to find a pilot that's going to really fit in with the rest of the body of work that you create, the rest of the years that you're on the air. But I think, not only do I think this is a great pilot, I think this is a pilot that is better than many of the episodes we'll see coming down the pike at some point.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to rank this episode is way above average to me. I'm going to rank it a 7, which in terms of pilot, I don't think you can get much higher than that. So yeah, a full 7 for me.
Yeah, and if this was the start and I hadn't seen all the other episodes coming up, I think I would rank it in 8, 9, or 10. But I'm going to agree with you on this one and say a 7 because it is definitely above average. But I also know what's coming, and I think we're going to only have some really good things ahead of us. So I'm going to say it's a 7 as well.
Yeah, so a very strong start. There's going to be episodes I'm sure we'll be ranking higher, and I'm sure there's going to be episodes we'll be ranking much lower, especially as we get toward the end of the run.
The bewitching pool. That's all I'm going to say. The girl who did it was Bullwinkle from Rocky and Bullwinkle is in the bewitching
Natasha.
pool.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh man.
Moose and Squirrel. Yeah. It's okay. We'll get there in 155 more episodes. So don't worry.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, but yeah, absolutely. But we thank you for making it through this first episode with us.
You make it sound like we put them in an isolation chamber. Hey, I remember what it was called now. Isolation chamber. we're torturing these poor people.
No. I think this was very enjoyable, and I think we're on to something here. I think this is a good start.
Second time's a charm.
In more ways than one.
We're just gonna leave that one alone.
So, yeah. So actually, before I read Rod's final words for this episode, do you want to do a little bit of plugging for us, Scott?
Absolutely. You can find us at the frontrowmoviereviews.com, where you'll be able to find all of our shows, which include Brandon's classics, my flashbacks. We have Behind the Mouse, which is our Disney podcast. We have news and reviews of all the new movies coming out as well, too. And you can find all that at the frontrowmoviereviews.com. Mm-hmm. You can also find us on YouTube at the Front Row Movie Reviews. Just search us that way, and that's where you'll find our lovely faces in these videos. And then you can also find us on all your social media platforms by searching the Front Row Movie Reviews. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we are on Instagram. The Twitter one is Front Row Reviews with a Z, because I guess we couldn't get the right one, but you can find us through all of that. And hopefully you like and subscribe to us in both the podcast form as well as on the YouTube form. Liking and subscribing us is what we need to get more people to check us out and see what's going on. So please do that. Even if you hate our guts, give us a like because you're feeling charitable. That's fine too.
Yes, and the next time we talk, we will be discussing the wonderful Mr. Ed Wynn. So that is more than incentive for you to come back. And we'll just leave it at that. And
we'll let Ed Wynn speak for himself, and no, he will.
Yes, he will. And as I provide you here with the very first closing narration you'll hear for any Twilight Zone episode. The barrier of loneliness, the palpable desperate need of the human animal to be with his fellow man, up there in the vastness of space, in the void that is sky, up there is an enemy known as isolation. It sits there in the stars waiting with the patience of eons, forever waiting in the Twilight Zone. So that's where we begin, and we move forward from here. And
as we move forward into the void.
Yes.
Very apropos.
And
sorry.
Yes. I'm go ahead.
No,
and I am your
Remember when I said like us? Don't unlike us now.
Yes.
Keep liking.
No,
go ahead.
Please don't. I am Brandon Davis.
And I am Scott McFarland.
And we will see you on the couch.
It's a comfy couch. Come join us.
Yes.
We don't bite too hard.
Oh, please.
Oh, please. Oh, please. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Zone-i-Sodes. Zone-i-Sodes is a special presentation of the Front Row Movie Reviews podcast. For more information, go to www.thefrontrowmoviereviews.com.